All right, hello out there again. Hopefully this is working a lot better. It says there's another error in the YouTube studio, so I don't really know. I guess we'll find out in a second. But everything seems to be streaming a little bit better. I still need to get Charles back into the call real quick, and we'll just get going on building things. But sorry, this was such a pain. I don't know what happened. We were trying to get everything going, and first sample of the test, everything worked fine, and then go live and everything breaks, right? It's just like releasing a game, right? Like build it all up, fix things, and then as soon as you go live, hit the button, the terror hits. Everything's busted. So that's what happened here. We're going to get going, though, and just start taking questions. I'm going to call Charles again. Let me see if he's ready. And then we'll go on, take some questions, and just start building up the project again. And hopefully with less streaming issues. I don't know what YouTube is doing. Hopefully it looks clear. In the little preview thing, it just keeps going black and showing up again. So I hope it's all good, right? Cool. Let's see. Charles, are you there? Are you ready? He's not answering yet. Well, I'm going to pull up the project and get that ready, and then just start looking at any questions that people had. If you guys have questions while waiting for Charles to hop in, feel free to just drop them in. So there's one question here that says, at the start of a project, we develop a prototype for basic mechanics, simple MVP. Do you guys refactor and test from the beginning, or just create working code and refactor later? That's a good question. A lot of the time what we'll do is exactly what we said. Make it work and then refactor later. If it's a bigger thing where it's going to be more of a giant architectural system or problem, then in that case, I try to plan it a little bit, but still make it work first. Jim mentioned that a lot of people are in the old stream. I'm going to see if I can just jump over there and tell them to join this one. Oh, man. Hey, hello. Give everybody just a couple more minutes to jump over, and hopefully we're all good. But yeah, what I would say is I normally try to make it work first. Then I guess the mantra I got from Chris was make it work, make it right, and then make it fast. Just kind of doing those three things in order. Getting it functional, making sure that the functionality that you want is there, that you're actually building the right thing, and then refactoring to optimize it so that it's as clean as possible, and then refactoring again to make it as fast as possible. But of course, a lot of the time it's easy to get those out of order too and start with making it fast and micro-optimizing things that you don't even need that you're going to end up deleting. Q&A is question and answer, by the way. Somebody asked in there, Ivan. But yeah, getting it working first, figuring out exactly how it should be working and if it's working right, and then going from there to make it better and make it faster. Let me see. Charles, are you here now? I'm trying to get him into the call. I think he might be rebooting, though. Okay, I've got to hide my preview because it's driving me nuts in here. It just keeps flashing black. Let's see. Do we have any other questions before we get going? Oh, is there a Discord community chat? Yes, I'm going to actually send out some links for that in email. You'll get all those in just a little while. Let's see. Oh, this other call still says it's live. Why does it still say it's live? Okay, let me kill that one. I'm killing the old call, everybody. Please, if you're on that one, hopefully you've jumped over now. Okay, what other questions do we have? Does Charles have his speaker on? I don't know. I think the echo issue was caused by some weird stuff we were doing, trying to stream and trying to get everybody's face on and the desktops on. Just all kinds of busted. So I need to figure that out, but we have not figured it out yet. Where is the option to disable this other stream? My goodness. Let's see. Live dashboard. Control room for the other one. And I'll kill it. All right. End that other stream. Okay, good. There's nobody in it anymore. They're all gone. Perfect. Everybody's come over to the new one. I can refresh the new one. So what other questions do we have real quick before we get going? Let's see. What is this? C4 Cheetah. How can we verify our game idea from an earning point of view? How can we adopt a certain earning model in our game, whether it should be ads or no ads? Ooh, that is, that's a very difficult question. So it's way beyond like an architectural question or a coding question. It's more of a figuring out what's going to be popular. And that is, I'd say, extremely difficult. I'm calling Charles right now. Let's see if he answers. Second. Here's Skype ringing for him. Come on, Charles. Are you there? Okay, I'll wait for him to call me. Okay. But yeah, it's really hard to say like what game is going to be popular. I have no idea, and I'm not personally really good at vetting that. I don't think. There we go. I've got Charles up here.
Hey,
Cool.
how's it going?
There we go. Okay, cool. Can you see me? All right, Charles. I don't know. Let me stop the NDI. There we go. That might fix it. I don't know. Well, you're on
Yeah,
screen at least.
cool. Hey, something.
Cool. All right. So yeah, I was just answering some questions real quick, and then figured we'd go in once you were in here. Now that it
Nice.
finally started working, and a couple people jumped back over to the new call.
Cool.
Is everything going good on your end now?
I don't see it in my Streamlab, or not my Streamlab, my streaming dashboard, but it's cool, man. We can keep going.
Okay. Well, if you're watching here, make sure you go subscribe to Charles' channel. It's
I just
infallible
dropped a
code.
new video yesterday, so if you guys could like and share, that would make me very happy.
Yep. Just go hit it. His stuff's always good. It's always really accurate and technical. I love it.
Thank you.
Let's see. What other questions did we have real quick before we get going? Why so many people want to build an MMO? Why don't people build classic games like MU Online and Cabal Online? I think people want to build MMOs because they're just a lot of fun, right? MMOs are a ton of fun to play, and everybody has like this big idea of what they want in an MMO, what they want to be different. Like a lot of time I don't know how many times I've talked to people who want like World of Warcraft, but with a couple changes to the class that they like. Like their whole goal, like they want to build an MMO just because they want it to be a little bit different. But a lot of times it's just because it's also a fun giant project you can build that has a huge community, and it's the kind of game that you can build and share with people and see other people playing and kind of play with them at the same time and really get into. I don't know. I really love MMOs though, so it could just be that I'm biased. Um,
I like them too. They're fun to think about, and I would say even from a technical perspective, it's fun to kind of work out some features that are only possible in an MMO, a big, massive multiplayer online game. But yeah, they're very hard. They're harder than people think.
Definitely, yeah. Can everybody hear Charles okay? That's an important question. I hope so.
I know we had some echo before.
Yeah. Hopefully my desktop audio is coming through for you. Should be.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, can you link your channel in? Oh, you did. You just made a smiley face. He's the infallible code guy. That's fine. Okay. Let's see.
That's
What other
me.
questions did we have, real quick? I'm scrolling back up so I don't miss them. Best way to code a game. What a question. Let's see. Okay, wait. Here. Oh, I think there's one about what's the best setup to cover as much possible screen mobile resolutions for setting up. So that's a good question. What do you when you're doing mobile stuff, Charles? I don't do a lot of mobile stuff anymore. But when you're setting up multiple resolutions on your games, do you just make multiple scenes at different resolutions? Do you try to auto scale them? What do you have
I
a preference there?
I try to auto scale them personally. Obviously, there's going to be some edge cases where you just can't get away with that. But yeah, I try to do auto scaling as much as possible.
Yeah, that's probably where I would go now. In the past, though, what I've done is building separate UIs for iOS and stuff. It was the time when I was really doing a lot of that stuff. Hold on, I've got to hide this window. It's driving me nuts. The time when I've done a lot of mobile stuff like that was when the new iPhones, the Retinas, were coming out, and we had to do separate interfaces and separate stuff all for those. But it was also we had to have separate art assets and things that got downloaded to make it work. Let's see. Next question. What do you suggest for publishing my finished mobile game? Work with a publisher or do it alone? Well, I've released a couple mobile games without a publisher, and none of them really took off. So maybe a publisher is the right way to go. I'm not really sure though. I think in general you want to be advertising your mobile game long before you release it, but I'm not sure what the best advice is for getting out a game like that. Have you worked with a publisher at all on your
I have
stuff?
not, no,
Yeah, I
personally.
haven't either outside of like a AAA studio where we had publishers. So I'm not sure. I mean, I've heard a couple good things. I've also heard a lot of horror stories on Reddit and stuff. So I would maybe go, if you're looking at a publisher, at the very least, do a lot of research on them, because I mean I've seen some that they say they're a publisher. It's some guy doing some stuff online and not really pushing games and just taking a cut, or taking all of their money was some of the worst cases, where like the money was going through the publisher was never paying the developer. They basically just brought somebody in to take away all their money and steal it. So watch out for that. I don't think that that's probably the norm, but I'd say just research whoever you're looking at working with and make sure that you get good references that things worked out right. Let's see. Oh, and Jason recommends setting the resolution as high as possible and use anchors. Yep. Okay. Somebody asked, what is game architecture? Oh, okay. That's because I have it in the title. I didn't even realize that. Game architecture, it's just all about how it's the bigger picture of how you're building the game, the way that all of the systems are put together. It's kind of the combination of patterns and components that you're building into this big thing, and it's a process of keeping it clean. It's kind of like, I think of it a lot like building architecture, right? Like you could have a building that's got an architecture, it's all planned out, you know what's going where, what you're putting together, and build that house out. Or you could just hire some guys and say, hey, go build me a house, right? Like, yeah, I want 2 stories and 5 rooms, and that's it. Architecture is that bigger definition, so that you don't end up moving the bathroom 7 times, right? Or adding another room because it wasn't clear how to do things, or having stairs that are coming up from the outside, or a ladder that you got to get into a room. It's that kind of stuff where you're planning out what you're going to do and how all of your things are going to work, and then fixing it when they're not perfect, right? Going back through, refactoring it, and keeping that architecture nice and solid and clean. So if you run into problems, you want to be able to address them and clean them up, and kind of have an idea of how you're going to do that. So having a good architecture, it's all about that kind of stuff, and it allows you to just move fast, build faster, release faster, and not have so many problems. Sometimes it allows you to release it all. You get a bad enough game that's got big enough problems, you run into the problem where you never get to the point where you can release, because you're constantly fixing things as you try to finish it, and you never get to finish the game. Thoughts on that, Charles?
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much hit the nail on the head with that description. It's like it's a plan for how you're going to develop your game. If you use the analogy of building architecture, you could have a whole bunch of cinder blocks, and you can start stacking them up, and as you go, create a rectangle and say, this looks like it could be a room, and then build it up and say, maybe I'll add a staircase. The second floor would be kind of cool. So then you'd start doing that, and that could technically work, but you're going to run into issues. So the architecture is planning ahead of time. So you already know before you even picked up the first block that you're going to have a staircase. So to prepare to have enough blocks for that staircase and stuff like that. Now, I will say, if you're like me, you oftentimes find yourself over-architecting, which is you start designing an entire mansion, and you really only have the time and resources to build a 2-floor suburban house.
With your super advanced staircase that's automatic, and
yeah, exactly. A new age staircase.
3 years on just the lighting for the staircase and never finish the room, right? That happens a lot of the time, where we just sit there and focus on one little piece of the thing, or like focus on one chunk that's like somewhat important, but really a waste of time, or build up this giant system to do a simple little thing.
Yeah.
That was a really good analogy too. I like that. Okay, let's see what else we got. At what point of the project do we apply Zenject or any other DI framework?
Good question. I guess I can take that one, since I have a whole I have a whole course on Zenject on my channel, which is now, they have a fork of it called Extendject. Gosh, that was hard to say. You should check that out. Extendject. Anyway, so you really don't want to put the cart before the horse. And I know that Jason's going to be in chat saying this too. You want to make sure that you need a DI framework before you go in and invest in adding it to your project. Just because it can get heavy, and it can add a lot of bloat and extra code to your project that you might not need. So try handling your dependencies ahead of time, And then if it really gets to a point where you need sophistication in how you pass those dependencies around, well, then you should really start exploring adding something like Zendesk, Zenject. My gosh.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think DI is huge in the web world and just in enterprise apps, and it makes 100% sense there because there's no cost, right? There's no downside. In Unity, I think there's somewhat of a startup cost to using it. It adds a lot of complication, and if you're not going to be swapping things out and you're not going to be taking advantage of any of the DI functionality, then it's probably not time to do it.
I mean, you can do dependency injection on your own. You don't need a framework. I mean,
Right.
if you set up your classes with inverted dependencies, then just the fact that you're passing in objects into other objects is kind of like your own sort of injection, if you
Oh
think
yeah.
about it.
Yep. Constructor injection. That's the way I like to do it. Just
Yep, same
inject
here.
everything in the constructor of the objects that you're creating while you're creating them. And you can do that somewhat manually. You don't necessarily. I find that a DI framework tends to confuse people a lot if they're not used to it. If you're like I said, you're at a web shop and you're using a DI framework, everybody there should know how it works, right? Everybody should understand it. If you're working in a game company, though, most people are going to get confused. You're going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out why things are wrong and helping people figure out those problems. So it's not something I would jump to on your own.
I will say though, two things about that. When if you are working on a team, and you do use something like Zenject, it could be a good thing because now you have an abstraction that everyone can understand. Assuming your whole team knows what Zenject is and how it works, then you don't really need to describe to them, oh yeah, for this particular app, I set up the dependencies in this class and I pass them over here. You could just, I mean, it's kind of nice to be able to say, hey, we're using Zenject, and so knowing that, you can just open up the project and have a pretty good idea of how things are getting loaded in. Another thing I'll say is that using Zenject and dependency injection frameworks in general, I know it can get bloated, but I've always felt really warm and fuzzy inside when I have all that wired up and really nicely, because it's like, ah, good. I know it's working. I don't know. There's just something about it. It just doesn't make any sense, but I just feel good.
The joy of like seeing the architecture working.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I think that's just my
even if
tendency to
it's too
over
much sometimes.
my tendency to over architect things. I love seeing,
You're not the
that.
only one. Don't get me wrong. One of the first things I did when I got good at dependency injection was try to figure out how to make it work with Unity. How do I make
Yep.
this happen in Unity? I got to do it right. Okay, let's see. Oh man, there's so many questions coming in. I'm way slow on them. Let's catch up. Oh, somebody said Charles is much louder than me. Let me turn you down a little.
Oops.
There, it's fine. I turned you down on my end.
I'll take this moment to like your video. It's like
Okay, let's see
a
what else we
shameless
got
plug.
here. Somebody subscribed. I got to scroll way back up. Um, somebody thought they were getting called on Skype. Oh, and Ivan asked about how to write more unit tests and make more tutorials about that. I've considered making some more about it myself. They just don't tend to be very popular. I think it's super important to do, but it's just really hard to get the context right in there. So that's kind of one of the things I'm going to hit a lot in this course that's coming out too. I'll put a link for that in the description too. And then Thomas asked about the Ultimate Edition of the course. Do weekly calls for the duration of the course or indefinitely? The plan was to go for at least the duration, and then if people want to stay on after that, awesome. I assume it'll kind of take off. And what he's talking about there is the Ultimate Architect course that it's just on. Just go to game.courses, you'll see it. But it's just another version of the course where we're going to be building up some new systems and designing and figuring out some special things that we want to put into the course for things that people really want to learn that just aren't covered anywhere else. As long as they fit into the whole RPG type game that we're going to build and the really big systems that we want to put together. Let's see, what other questions we got? The project I work with started as a simple game with a few UI screens. For some time, it was okay to have all the UI objects in the scenes with hard links via Unity events. I don't know if there's a question there, but I assume that the question is, how do we stop this from being a problem later? Because have you done that before, Charles, where you built up everything with Unity events in the UI?
Um, it's a funny thing about Unity events. I have used them, and I think the word event is kind of like probably like a misnomer because they're not really events. They're really serialized function calls. And it's just a way for you to use a UI to say call this function. You know,
Do you use
when
them though, or I'm
yeah,
curious
I
how
use
you.
them. I
Okay.
use them occasionally.
Do you use them heavily? Because I know I tend to not use them very heavily. I'll use them on small prefabs or small components maybe, or in a game where it's all designers and I'm just setting up a system for designers to build things. But
Yeah.
most of the time, I try to avoid them myself just because I find it's really hard to find those dependencies and the references and stuff. I really like to be able to hit Shift F12 in Writer and find all the dependencies and references to things and know how stuff is hooked up without having to load up a scene and go look at prefabs, because that's just a dramatically slower process if you're a programmer. By the way, I just saw we only have 27 likes, and I think the previous video that I totally screwed up had more. So if you guys don't mind hitting the button, it just helps bring in more people, and that's awesome. I don't know.
Yeah, no. So I don't really use them heavily, but you made a good point. I think if the class that you're writing is fundamentally like something that's going to be like at the topmost level of a prefab, like maybe a facade class that kind of handles all the functions of a prefab and all the inner method calls. I think in that sort of case, yeah, you can go ahead and use Unity events because it is inherently something that a designer is going to be messing with. But if it's not, yeah, you really don't want to obscure uh, obscure how your code is being called, and that's one way to do it because you won't be able to reliably know where those your methods have been wired up.
Yeah, not without going into those prefabs and looking at all this stuff, and it's a pain. There was actually a question right down a bit further that kind of ties into that too, which was Jason or Charles, can you give a quick recap of on the disadvantages of the observer pattern with scriptable objects in game dev? Which I think is the exact like the only downside is the exact one that you just laid out, right?
Yeah, I
It's just
mean, you're just basically you're obscuring and hiding calls to your code,
but
and you
if you
want
have a design heavy team, that's perfect, I think, because then you're
yeah, I
making it,
agree.
you're exposing it to them, but you're obscuring it from the coders. If you have a code heavy team, then it's the opposite.
Like if I'm writing a class that is going to be like a data structure, um, and that's all it's going to do, there's no way I'm going to put a Unity event on that. But if I'm going to write a mono behavior that isn't really performing any business logic, but maybe is managing some element in the UI, sure, yeah, I'll hook up a Unity event for that. If there's something that like, maybe I want to play a sound or trigger something to maybe like a scene load, I don't know. Yeah, that would make sense.
Let's see what else we got. So if you're starting a real-time, low-player count multiplayer game in Unity today, what networking package would you use, or how would you choose one?
What was the type?
Is a real-time, low latency, a low-player multiplayer game. So I assume this is like 8 or 16 player, high speed, first person or something like that. If I scroll down, I'm gonna lose context of my chats. But yeah, something like that. So it depends a lot on the scale. If it's really like you're building a AAA FPS, you're probably going to need to implement your own network layer right now. I don't think that there's at least the built-in stuff isn't going to be fast enough if you want to go to like, I want to be Fortnite or Overwatch. But if you just want to have like a small game that's medium, you want to have, like you said, 8 to 16 players, you could probably go with something like Photon. Um, or one of the other services out there. I haven't used any of them in a while. Recently, just been using all custom stuff. So it's all like custom UDP for really. This is a totally different scale though. We're talking like thousands of players instead of a dozen or so. So I'm not sure what the best option is today. I know that they're working on a new network layer, but I mean UNet got deprecated, and the thing before that got deprecated. So who knows if the new thing will make it out or if they'll end up having a third party option that's better or something. So I would look at Photon, maybe take a look at Bolt, and then somebody in chat might have some more recommendations too. Charles, do you have any?
I'd write a networking layer that prints out the function calls onto little pieces of paper, and then I would train a bunch of pigeons to fly them to a central pigeon coop, and then collect the messages and fly it to everyone's computer. I don't know, man. That's a question
Fair
that
enough.
no, I don't
Okay.
know. I would just do the research and just see what works out best for whatever the use case.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I
as you,
still, my buddy Kyle knows a ton about all the different network options. I'd love to get him in here and just do a call on networking too. And
yeah,
he can answer all these questions way better than I can. He's used every one of the packages and knows everything about them. So it's kind of crazy. Let's see. What else we got here? What is a publisher's job? That's just to promote your game, sell it, and deal with all of the legal and all that other stuff. Um, Mostly it's to promote your game, though. Usually they have a marketing budget. They put stuff out there. They get your game sold, and a lot of the time they fund your game too in development. I mean, I'd say most of the time, a real like a AAA publisher funds the development of the game, or at least a big portion of it. What's the best way to push ourselves to sticking to design patterns without returning to bad coding habits?
mm, educate yourself first and foremost, so you're not using patterns incorrectly or when you don't need to. I think that'd be a good start. Definitely read up and understand I mean, design patterns, just to kind of clarify, they're just descriptions of common ways to solve common problems, common solutions to common problems. So, I mean, you might be using design patterns without even knowing what you're using. You know what I mean? Because it's just a definition for something people have already do. Um, so I don't know. I guess also educate yourself on bad habits and code smells. Educate yourself on code smells, because I think knowing about those two topics, the code smells that are out there, and then the design patterns that are out there, then you'll have a clear understanding of I guess the options at your fingertips, and then you'll be more likely to use those options.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. It's kind of hard to stick to keeping things clean if you don't know what bad looks like, right? If you don't know what's
Yeah.
bad. And like you mentioned with people doing design patterns without knowing it, that happens all the time too. But what usually happens is they have like a very close representation of a design pattern, of a very common design pattern that's just a little bit off. Things are named a little bit weird, and functionality is just usually not quite exactly the best that it could be. But most of the time, yeah, we're building like repository patterns and command patterns without even knowing it.
Yep.
Without knowing that there's like a very well defined set of examples of how to do this as clean as possible with all the functionality too. So you find yourself doing something that you think somebody has done before, start looking up how they did it. Say, hey, how did this system work in this game? A lot of time you can Google it, and if it's a big game with developers who like to talk, there will be articles about how they put the thing together and how it all works. So I'd check that stuff out too. But if it's just to keep yourselves from doing bad stuff, I don't know. It's just the suffering from all the bad code over time really forces you to not want to see it again and to want to do clean things and make everything nice. All right. During architecture, my game, how can I think architect my game. How can I verify? Oh, I gotta read this. Oh, it's just talking about revenue streams and stuff. How to figure that out, and I'm terrible at that. Like figuring out game revenue streams, I'm no good at that. Like monetizing a mobile game, I can build one, but getting people to buy it and monetizing and keeping track of how much money each person's spending, I don't know. I know that there are big teams that do that stuff, like at a high level. I would worry mostly just on making a really fun game and getting that out there. And if the game's, because you're going to have one of two situations. Either you have a game that's a big hit and a lot of people love it and you make a ton of money, or you don't. And that's it. There's really not much in between, right? Like you can make a couple $100, or you can make tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, right? Or millions. There's not a whole lot in between there. At least not that I've seen. So I'd go for make the game really fun and then monetize, I don't know, somehow in there. But it depends a lot on the game, I guess. Okay, let's
Okay.
see. Let's find some more questions here. Is there a Discord chat for the architecture course? Yeah, that's coming. I'll send an email about that, I think. How do you fight perfectionism, Charles?
How do I fight perfectionism? That was
Yeah.
a question. Um, that's I don't know. I don't know. I'll tell you. I guess admitting that you're a perfectionist is the first step to to becoming better because I am a total perfectionist and it has caused me a lot of grief in my career, um, and a lot of wasted time. Not to, I mean, okay, yeah, a lot of wasted time. I don't know. I guess once I started realizing, I mean, the fact that you would realize that you're a perfectionist and that it is a problem, that's a pretty good start. So you just got to know when to move on. I guess one thing, this is like weird, like this is just a thought I've been having recently about just work in general and things that I do and try to accomplish even outside of coding, if even if it's like, oh, I got to do the laundry or go to the gym. I try to look past the thing that I'm working on right now. So, if it's like, oh, I got to do the laundry now, and I don't want to do it. Well, I just think, what am I going to do after I do the laundry? Oh, well, I'm going to sit at my computer and I'm going to work on, an inventory system that I've been working on. Well, what am I going to do after that? So I just try to look through the things that I'm doing. And that's the same thing when you're working on something and you find yourself really tinkering on it over and over and over, and you're trying to perfect it. And you're like, hey, it works, it's functional, but maybe I want to change the classes around or change the design. And you're like, when you're a perfectionist, that's what really happens. You really start to nitpick. You just need to say, okay, let me look, what's the next thing I'm going to do? If I've solved this problem, what's the next step? And for me personally, that really helps me just in general because I find myself overworking and over architecting and overdoing everything. So I just have to say, okay, I'm working on this right now, but what's the next thing I'm going to do? And that allows me to just kind of keep myself honest. I don't know if that was helpful.
I think so. Just looking at, because it's like you said, it's easy to get focused in on one thing and forget the big picture and forget all of the other things, right? You can spend 7 hours updating this little UI element that nobody's going to see and you're going to probably end up deleting later anyway. Or you can, spend half an hour on it and then go on to the next thing and keep getting things done. For me, the biggest thing that kind of taught me that lesson was writing a lot of really fancy, really cool architected stuff and it never getting used multiple
Hmm.
times over and over. Like write this whole library, this whole layer of stuff, and be like, oh yeah, well the game idea for it isn't that fun anyway, so I'm not going to build it, and it's just throw it away, right? And just constantly throwing away too much stuff and wasting too much time on things that I just don't need.
Yeah.
Let's see. I'm trying to catch up with questions. I don't even know if we get to building anything.
Which I'm actually I was hesitant earlier to say that it was a waste of time because I mean it really was inherently, like, let's say it's for my job, yeah, from a business standpoint and productivity standpoint, it's a waste of time to just continuously tinker at the same thing because you're not getting any value out of that. But I have gotten value from these sessions where I am like just super anal and perfectionist because it just allows me to explore. Like if I redesign the same thing multiple times because I'm not happy with it, I do explore many different paths towards that goal. So I don't know. For me, I do find myself allowing myself for times to work on things that don't mean anything, or maybe I'll make a branch of code off of like the main branch of a project, and I'll just give myself some time, free time to just mess around with it, and knowing that it's not going to go anywhere. And I don't know. I think that would help too if to like itch that scratch if you're a perfectionist, just to give yourself some free time to just be a perfectionist a little bit.
Oh, definitely. I also share it with other people too. Like get some feedback. If
Oh
you're
yeah.
struggling to get something perfect enough, just bring in a friend, bring in a coworker, and have them take a look at it and run them through it and see what kind of advice they have. Because a lot of the time, like the change that you need to make is minor, and it's very easy to go way overboard and create way too much stuff for this minor little thing that you wanted. Um, and just spend too much time doing it, and it can take a long time to get to that point. Having just a fresh set of eyes on the project or the code, I think, can go a long way. And in fact, I know it can. There's nothing better than a fresh set of eyes on your code when there's a problem. Just going through, they're going to see the thing that you've looked at 1,000 times and totally missed, or the
Yep.
architectural idea that you totally overlooked. Speaking of that, though, Cole asked the question: do you map out all of your systems as much as possible before you start coding, or do you prototype a few systems while thinking about how they'll interact? I like to prototype my systems and figure out how I kind of want them to interact, but I also am like writing in a notebook at the same time, figuring out what all of the systems are. I usually have some idea of what they are and how they're going to tie together, but I try not to pre-plan how I'm going to code that. So I'll plan out what's going to hook up to what, or like what the different systems are, but not so much the interconnections at least on paper. What about you, Charles? Do you plan all that stuff out in advance, like the interconnections between all your systems, or just all the systems, or none of it, or?
I take the same approach as you do. I try to start with the user. I just try to think, if I'm playing this game or let's say it's a particular feature of the UI, I just think, what is it going to look like when it's done? How is the user going to use this? And then I just kind of work from there, work down. And probably the last step would be the implementation details when I actually get to coding. But I try to understand what it is I'm trying to do well in advance.
And then
Of
when you get your implementation details in, are they usually right the first time, or do you find yourself going back and making updates
um,
and changing things and refactoring?
I think it's like 50-50. I mean, I would say obviously it's never right the first time, but as long as you code things to be flexible, and there's using good design patterns and kind of best practices, and you can leave your code in a state that it's flexible enough and that it'll either be easily reused or easily refactorable. And so whether or not it's right the first time, it's not like it's a waste of time. It's never like a waste of time.
Right, and that's as long as you keep things clean, right? You have
Yeah.
to keep things clean, separated, and kind of componentized for that to happen. It's very easy to do the opposite of that and make a big giant monolith that's extremely hard to change, which is kind of another key part of having good architectures, having everything in these separate modular pieces that are easy to refactor. It's the S in solid, right? That single responsibility principle. Things should really only have one reason to change. So if you're changing your inventory system, you shouldn't have to change your combat system or any other systems, right? Your stat
Yep.
system. It should just be inventory only. If you're changing stats, you shouldn't have to change all your other systems, right? And you may have to change the way they interface with it slightly, but you shouldn't have to make big changes to things. And you should set that up so that the interface is abstracted away.
The only time I write throwaway code is when I'm explicitly prototyping. Like when I put my prototyping hat on, I'm creating a project and I'm thinking to myself, I don't know if this game mechanic or if this feature is going to work. Maybe it's something I've never seen before, or I haven't experienced it myself in any other games or projects, and it's like completely proprietary. I would say, okay, let me slam together a prototype and hand it off to someone, a couple of people to see if it actually plays well. A good example of that is I think Jonathan Blow, the guy who created Braid and The Witness, he has a, I don't know where it is, but I saw a video once where he was talking about this very thing, and he prototyped a game where he thought it would be cool if it was like an RPG with magic elements, fantasy RPG, and he was like, oh, maybe it'd be cool if like the user had to, or the player had to draw a glyph in order to cast a spell. And like obviously think about that. Where have you ever seen that before? So for something like that, it's not something like movement or an inventory system. It's like this completely fresh idea that it's like you don't really know if it's going to work. So in that case, I would say, well, let me just slam some really ugly code together just so I can get something functional in front of my friends as fast as possible. And what happened with him is that he did that, got in front of some friends, and they were like, dude, this is not fun. And so he was like, okay, got it. And he just didn't develop it. So that's like the only time I'd ever really
It's
write
funny.
code
I
that
did something very similar.
yeah.
A very prototype. It was a VR version of the same kind of thing where you had to like wave your hand around in a thing to do it.
Oh,
And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's not fun. It did it really simple. It was just like set up some spheres with triggers. You got to hit them in order. That's it, right? Nice and easy, quick
yeah.
prototype. Not very fun, not very exciting. Even with cool tracers and visuals, like having to match some weird thing. It doesn't add to the game having to do more physical stuff in VR. There's already too much physical stuff you get to do. Okay, let's see what else. We had some more questions. Okay, here's a good one too. He says, I want to make a generic game framework for Unity, which I can use in every game for speeding up the development process. It would include common scripts and game events. How should you do it? I would say don't. Don't do that. That's kind of exactly the over-architecting that we're talking about here. And I've done it myself. Don't get me wrong. It's not like it's a bad idea. It's just probably a waste of time. Usually, good game architectures and those frameworks come out of an existing game. So there's a game that people want to build. They build a framework kind of while they're building the game, and then they adjust that framework for their next game and their next game. And like by game 3, it's good. Very, very hard to just pre-build a framework for games and know what's needed and have an idea, have everything in there and have it be right. You'll probably end up just coding yourself into a corner a lot of the time and having to go back and constantly change your framework and put hacks in there and stuff. I would generally avoid that. I don't know about you, Charles. I'd just go straight for the game.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I kind of caught the back half of the question. It was about creating a framework for your game.
Creating a framework to build all the games and make new games easier to build.
Yeah, I heard your answer, and given that the question is that, I totally agree. It's I mean, frameworks typically just are built organically, after a couple games, like you said, and yeah, unless you have unless you consider yourself a subject matter expert on a particular genre, like if you've written tons of platformers and you've thought of pretty much every thing or problem that could possibly arise from when creating a platformer. If that's the case, if you're a subject matter expert, like I'm talking, you can write a thesis paper on it, and a book and multiple books, then maybe you might have the expertise to write a framework to build one. But I mean, otherwise, you just got to be realistic.
I feel like it's just it overcomplicates things most of the time, right?
Yeah.
And
It could be a
there's
fun
not-
exercise that's educational, but
Oh yeah, it's a lot of fun. Don't get me wrong. It's not like there's no value in it. It's a blast doing it, but I wouldn't say that you're gonna be more productive or get your game done faster that way.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're definitely not going to.
Let's see. Drago asked about data binding and MVVM. I stopped using MVVM after web stuff. I take it back. Still use it in Windows stuff, WPF stuff for game tools, but I don't use it in Unity at all. That's the model view model pattern.
Yeah.
Data binding you use all the time though, and most of the time that's just simple observer pattern, just things registering for events. So that what happens is like you have a UI element and you have a player. Maybe the UI binds to the player, and then when the health changes on the player, the on health changed event kicks off. The text thing that's bound to it updates or gets the event, fires it off, gets the new health value, and then does an update. Usually a little bit more complicated than that. It might be like the UI system or a UI panel that's bound to an individual player or character, depending on how many players and characters you have in your game. If it's a single player game, then it's probably just one player bound to one UI, nice and simple. But it's essentially just using events to fire off callbacks when things have changed. That's what you want to do. The biggest thing you don't want to do is fire them off constantly when there's no change. You only want to fire off the event if things have actually changed and if it's something that things are actually registering for, where it makes sense to change it, right?
Yep. I agree completely. MVVM, I use that to build web apps on my day job, but just doesn't seem to have a place in game development.
It's another one of the situations where we're just overcomplicating things. And then somebody asked if you have to be good at math to be a programmer.
Nope.
I always tell people multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. If you can do those okay in your head, you're 90% of the way there. The rest of it you can figure out, you can Google and learn. If you really struggle with like basic multiplication and math, you're going to run into problems where things get confusing, but you'll probably figure it out as you go along. I found that people can learn math pretty well from doing game development just because you're doing relatively simple things and you're using it constantly. A lot of the time people get bad at math because they just never use it. If you use math, like if you have to figure out percents of things all the time every day, you get really good at it, right? It's easy to figure out what 30% of something is if you have to do that every day when you're updating some UI element, right?
Yep.
And then obviously, if you get better, if you're really good at math, it can come in super handy, right? There are some spots in game development where having advanced math skills makes a huge difference. It can have a huge benefit, but 98% of the stuff that we do is really just logical flow control, not so much math. Unless you're a graphics programmer, right? In that case, yeah, you're doing math nonstop, and you need to be good at it, or you're not going to do it, right? You're going to hate it. Um,
Yeah, it's like it's the interesting thing about programming that I don't know if a lot of people understand. Like, you don't really need to be. I mean, you can be really good at one thing and still apply. Still learn programming, and if you're a graphics programmer, you're gonna need to know a lot about math in that case. But if you're, I don't know, you could be someone who's really good at science or gardening, and you could program an application that helps calculate when the best time to water your plant is. That was a terrible example, but basically, you can be a subject matter expert in many different things. Some people are really good at AI or machine learning, right? But other people are really good at encryption. So the encryption guy might not really be good at machine learning, and the machine learning guy might not be good at encryption. But they're both really intelligent programmers. I'll also say that you don't need to be good at math.
so I was just updating my description while you were talking. Hopefully that wasn't too loud.
No,
Yeah,
that's cool.
I totally agree. It's weird though, because everybody thinks that you need, from the outside, everybody thinks that you need to be good at math, and I don't really understand why. Because it's not like computers and math. Like, I mean, internally inside, sure, there's a lot going on, but like when you're normally working with a computer, how much math are you doing? It's not a common thing. Maybe it's just people get used to the whole like computers are for spreadsheets. I don't know. But yeah, I guess it's definitely not as hard as you think though. Let's see what else we got here. Questions. I may have lost a couple. Is anyone interested in UI elements? I am, but I'm waiting till 2020. I don't know about you. That's the new
I think
UI
it looks
system.
cool. I mean,
I
I like what they're doing with it, but I think it. I want to say that probably makes more sense for mobile development, and then also probably makes most sense for like editor tools, especially editor tools. But
mhm.
I'm not really sold on it as being a replacement for like in-game UIs.
Yeah, I'm not either. I'm not there yet. I'm ready to try it out in 2020, but I'm just waiting until I know what it's gonna look like. I don't want to practice with it and then it changes too much. Hmm. Sorry guys, I gotta take a bite of my Quest bar. I was getting really, really hungry. Let's see what else we got here. Somebody was asking for book recommendations outside of clean code. Got a couple recommendations for design patterns book. Game programming patterns book is really good too. It's C++, but it still completely applies and makes sense. And a lot of those patterns make sense in a game development or environment where they wouldn't make sense outside of it. So I'd highly recommend that. And I also like Code Complete was a good one. What you got there, Charles? It looks like you just grabbed a good book out.
Yep, this is the one I'm reading right now. I'm reading it again. Actually, it's starting to unit test, not as hard as you think. It's taking me a little bit longer to read this one because I haven't had a lot of time. But yeah, that's the one I was reading on our last stream. It's a great one.
Yeah, unit testing is amazing too, and it's definitely not as hard as people think. I take that back. It can be as hard if you try to shove it into an existing project and don't know what you're doing. It's extremely hard then, and
This
that's
book
what
covers
usually
just that. Yeah,
people do, right?
yeah.
That's why they struggle because for their first set of tests, they're like, "Hey, I have this project that's got all these problems. I want to make some tests for it." It's a good idea, but you want to know how to make the tests first. You don't want to be practicing and trying to figure out on your live project just because it's harder. It takes a lot more time. You're going to break things and you got to figure out how to refactor things. That being said, I've done that myself a couple times and eventually it works out. It just, like I said, takes some time and a lot of dedication. You have to really want to do it, but the payoff is enormous, right? The payoff from making your code unit testable and tested is huge. You don't just get the benefit of like things didn't break and you know if something broke, right? With unit tests, you run them every time you commit, you know if something broke. But you get the benefit of your code not being crappy, right? You get clean, separated code. It's not automatic. Like you could screw up your code still, but most of the time, if your code is tested and testable, you've kind of got to follow a lot of those solid patterns to make it happen, and it gets a lot cleaner along the way. And you'll find that you have to refactor and separate things to make it even testable. How about you, Charles? Have you ever gone in and just try to add unit tests in an existing project?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of experience now, and so I kind of know the techniques to do it, and that really just consists of a lot of indirection. So, you have a monolithic method, which is the most common situation. You begin to strip that out, strip out pieces into methods, and then you can take those methods and put them into classes where they can be tested on their own. Another thing that you see a lot in legacy code systems or just very ugly codes, the bases, would be static global references to static global variables, and in that case, you can't really account for those in your test because you just have no idea what they're going to be, the values. So yeah, I mean, I have experience, and I've spent a lot of time. If there's anything I would consider myself, I mean, I'm not a subject matter expert, but if there's anything that I think I have the most experience in, it's probably unit testing. And yeah, I can tell you, it's really not that hard, but it's very easy to overcomplicate, and it is very easy to do ineffectively. I guess
Yeah.
I don't want to say to do wrong, but ineffectively.
Yeah, that's true. But it's if you go the right way, it's easy to do good, amazing stuff. And I wanted to share, since you were talking about the refactoring, I'm gonna post it in chat. There's this video um, that I think is great, just on refactoring to more testable code and cleaner code. And they go through the whole process for 2 hours. Really nice video. Hit watch later on it and go watch it after the stream. And then when you come back, hit the like button here because we're still only up to half the number of viewers for likes. But yeah, I check that video out. It's really, really good. It's 2 hours, and they just go through and refactor code constantly, and you see the whole process. It's really well thought out and really well planned. I'd definitely check it out.
Since we're opening videos and tabs for later, be sure to open my latest video. I just posted it yesterday, and could use a couple more likes and shares.
You can post a link to that in the chat too.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay, let me see. There were some other ones. Any tips for programming games to be deterministic? You just have to remove all the randomness, not use the physics engine, and that's about it, right? You can't use any randomness at all. It depends on the game type too that you want to have. So, but the biggest problem there is just removing physics completely, and then probably going with some sort of command pattern or something to keep everything in lock and replayable.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on the kind of game, though. But usually that's what I see is a command pattern, all the commands queued up so that the whole game can replay back through, resume back through, and then when you rejoin a game, it basically replays the entire game instantly behind the scenes without rendering to get you back up to that point. That's the kind of thing that you want to do there.
I always like to,
Go ahead.
I always like to see unit tests that have like the game, like the actual game is being tested, and it plays the whole thing in a unit test.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty funny to see that.
So somebody else asked, or Rad Neighbor asked, in your videos you usually use Flappy Bird as an example of a small game that mostly doesn't need architecture. How would you define a medium game, what a medium game would be, and how would you architect that game to be different from a big game? It's a good question. Because yeah, like a Flappy Bird, you're wasted. It's one of those where you're going to over-architect anything. I would say that you need to worry about architecture if you're going to work on the project for more than like 2 or 3 months, right? If you're going to work on it for 2 months full time, worry a bit about your architecture. If it's part time, don't worry at all. If you're going to work on the project for 3 months or more and you're going to keep going on it, you need to have at least some plan. Now, again, you don't want to over-architect it. That's kind of one of the things that I think people misunderstand about having a good game architecture. I think a lot of time people feel like it's or assume that it's a big process that you're going through before you create the game, like all of this planning. And it's really not. It's really a lot about planning as you're going and refactoring as you're going too, and keeping things clean and knowing how to tie your systems together right, I guess. Mm-hmm. But how for a big game, though, I guess, because that was part of the question, the difference between that and a big game is that with a big game, you're going to want to work out that architecture with your entire team, and you're going to want to plan it a bit more because you have people working, usually on independent systems that need to interconnect. And what I would do is figure out what those systems are, how you want those systems to be, and figure out a baseline for how those systems should look. Don't have a bunch of people coding things all in different ways, right? Figure out a system, work on it together, see that you guys like it and agree on it, and then move on to the next one. And then you can start branching off and figuring out how those things are going to tie together. But you really want to work together as a team when you're working on a bigger project to figure out all of the architectural decisions. Try not to make those on your own if you don't have to. Like, try to get the team's buy-in on them so that everybody's coding the same way and to the same systems and standards, I guess.
I mean, if you think of a game, if we're talking about big games, think about Red Dead Redemption. You think when they add a quest to Red Dead Redemption, they have to touch the code? There's no way. When someone adds a quest to when they were working on that whole questing system and the story, they probably had higher level people working with editor windows, custom proprietary editor windows, and they were putting in information about, like, what's the state of the game, what stage of the game are the characters in, what's the dialogue that's going to be said, what's the goal of the quest. That's probably all just put in using a WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get editor, some sort of custom editor window. So in a game like that, you figure, hey, you get a bunch of developers and you tell them you're going to develop a quest system that's going to work in the game, but we also need to create all the tooling around that so that designers, storyteller type people can make the quest without you. And then same thing for what any other system that would be in that game. Like trying to think what other systems would be in there. Like I don't know, maybe the weather system they said, hey, listen, we want you to design a weather system that can create variable weather. Don't worry about what the weather's going to be. We'll have our artists come in and figure out what it's going to look like when it rains and what it looks like when it's going to snow. And you can go on and on with all the other systems in the game. But that's the idea. That's something that they had to architect that thing way up front.
Yep, and you got to work with the designers on those too, because you're building custom tools, either in editor tools or separate editor tools. A lot of time we have like custom tools to go place things in the world, where you're running around in like a custom client and setting things up, placing down the NPCs and figuring out their pathing. And you have to build all that out too. So when you're architecting things in a bigger project, you also want to get at least a bit of designer buy-in on how they're going to interact with the system, and most importantly, how the player is going to interact with the system, because it's easy to architect something that doesn't make sense when you get to actually implementing it for the players.
Not to mention, it's like you said earlier, Red Dead Redemption is probably based off of a framework that was created over years with all the Grand Theft Auto games and the previous Red Dead game. So I bet that quest system was they started working on that thing like years ago, and they've probably been iterating on it over and over and over. It's probably its own application at this point that they can just pull into a project.
That's how it is with most game companies. At Sony, it was kind of the same way. We had a whole team set up just to build a lot of the core tech, and then a lot of the games started just using that core tech, so that we didn't have to re-architect and reinvent everything every single time after it didn't happen that way at first, right? It was many projects in where they finally like, okay, we're building a lot of things and we keep doing it different ways. Let's fix that, right? And I think that happens at a lot of companies. Sometimes they come up with the one that they like at the beginning, and it's not very good too. I mean, I've talked to game developers who work at companies that have had systems that they've been using for a very long time, and they hate them because they're just old, crappy systems that now seem like a pain to work with. Like, it's harder to use than Minecraft, and it's too hard, right? But yeah, I think you hit it pretty well. I'm going to scroll to the bottom and try to keep up with the chat down there, because there's so many things. True. I totally lost it. So if you guys have questions and you didn't already leave or something, hit like and then repost the question real quick so I can answer them. Or we can figure out what they are. Have you used Houdini for procedural generation? I have not, but we are looking at it seriously for a game I'm working on. I think we're going to be using it. It seems like it's awesome, but I don't have a lot of experience with it myself. I've just talked to other developers who want to use it, and I don't see why we wouldn't. Have you used Houdini at all? It's procedural generation for all kinds of stuff. So you set up all the parameters and then make it so your game designers can go in and generate stuff and then modify it relatively easily and have it the generation just kind of work with the modifications. So it
Huh,
just kind of it makes it so
cool.
designers can make pretty levels without being an artist, basically.
Yeah, I like that. That
Yeah.
sounds awesome.
Speaking of, I know somebody had asked above. I remember seeing the question before it scrolled away about how much time you spend modeling as a developer and doing artwork. I was gonna say the same. None. Like that's for artists. Let the artists do the artwork. It's just like I know Dave and one other guy who are really good artists and programmers, but they're unique. Most of us are terrible artists. That's why they have coder art. That's why it's called coder art, right? Like, it's
Well,
always
that's a good point about, coder art. I mean, when you're programming your game, you should just stick really ugly placeholders in there. But, we talked about that tooling earlier. Make sure that there's some easy way, some easy mechanism for an artist to come in and change that art. That's how you know you're right. You're probably writing some good clean code or architecture is when, you have the boundary so clear that you can say, "Hey, designer, see all this ugly art? Go in here and replace it." And they should be able to do that.
right. It should be easy for them. It should be either no work or go add a component and select an option or something, right? It shouldn't be much beyond that. They shouldn't have to know anything about the code or much about the project, really. They should just be able to drop it in because that's really what you're going to get. If you're working with a bigger team, you're going to find a lot of artists just don't, they're not programmers, they're not game developers, they make art. They're not going to know necessarily how to do all that stuff. And a lot of times you're going to have to do it yourself. So you want to make that process nice and easy to get the art into game. Let's see. Let's see. Oh, what is this? I have all my code in one script that has 2,000 lines so far. I really need to
Holy.
figure out what to move into classes. Still learning. Oh, I really like that question because it's got the awareness right away that there's a problem, right? Because realistically, if all your code is in one file, that's a problem. If your class is 2,000 lines, that's a second problem. What you want to do is start to split this functionality off. Just start looking at the different methods in there and the different state data, which is like your properties and fields that are in there, and see what ones rely on each other and what areas you can logically separate. Like if you have a player and you have a weapon, you can separate those usually. There shouldn't be much reason that you can't separate those two parts. If you have like a movement system and an aiming system, you can probably separate those as well. It's hard to say exactly what to separate, but you definitely want to be splitting these things into classes. And it might seem really stupid at first, right? Like you're making a weapon class and then you're moving all that code there and then you're adding a weapon.fire on your thing that's just calling all that other code on the other class. But the benefit there is that then you can start cleaning these things up and changing them out. You can swap out the weapon, put in a new weapon. You can change the way the weapon works without changing your player, all that kind of stuff. So figuring out exactly what to move is a little bit hard. Kind of some of the stuff we'll be talking about in the course. But I also have, I'd say look at the some of the solid videos. Like go look at the single responsibility principle video that I did in the solid series when you get a chance. I think that one might kind of hit this really well and explain it. I think I talked about that one a long time. Let's see. What else we got here? By the way, yeah, if you have questions, feel free to drop them again. What do you think is a measure of balance between doing research and studying and learning and doing things, creating, just by like creating things? So
Other
going out
Jason
and
had a good
researching,
answer to that.
learning versus creating. What do you think, Charles? I know where
Uh,
I stand on this.
other Jason had a good answer to that one. I agree with him there. It's I believe that if you learn something, you should take it out for a spin and force yourself to hit a wall, doing it, and then go back, do some research, learn about it a little bit more, then go back. Like unit testing, that's a good example. So maybe read a light book about unit testing, get the idea, go in there, try to write some unit tests, get to a point where you get stuck and you're just like, I don't know what to do here. Then Google it or read another book. But other Jason had said 80-20, 80% practical, 20% study. So I kind of agree with that one.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Do it. I just like Charles said, do a little bit of research at the beginning, see what you can figure out, and then start building along as quick as you can. Don't do a lot of preloaded research. I wouldn't. Yeah, I probably wouldn't read through a whole book, but I would read through a couple chapters, get started, figure out those parts, then go through the next
Read
chapter.
this book. Look how tiny
Yeah,
it is.
or read a book that's that size, right? Like go through something quick and get started on it, because it's a lot easier to understand the things that you're learning if you have some practical context and some practical uses. If you're just reading it, I find it personally a lot harder for things to stick if I'm not using it and I haven't seen it actually in use, right? Like I just have this one abstract example. Coding it and running it helps a lot, I think.
Yep.
Okay, let's see.
And that goes for I mean everything. I would think. A couple years ago, I started doing this thing called bullet journaling. So I always have this journal on me. I'm always writing what I'm up to. And I read this book. There's a whole book about it. I read it, started doing it, and I felt like it wasn't really effective the way I was doing it, and I didn't know why. So I was like, you know what, I really want to do this. So I reread the book, and as I reread the book, I was like, oh my gosh, like all these little things that never really clicked the first time I read it because I didn't have any practical experience. And now rereading it and having had done it for a year, I was like, oh, I understand why they said this now. And or maybe like I read this, but I didn't realize that I wasn't even implementing it in the correct way. And that practical sort of knowledge helps you to really bring it all together.
Yep, I agree 100%. The other thing I would recommend too, if you have the ability when you're doing these things and learning these things, once you have a little bit of an implementation, if you have friends or contacts or other people who know it, run it by them, get their feedback, and tell them, make sure that you ask them not to be nice, right? Like tell them right away that you assume it's bad, you know it's going to be bad, and you want to fix it. So please be brutally honest and tell them how you would change it and how you would fix it. Get the best advice you can. Don't get hurt by it. Don't, because you're going to do it wrong the first time. Everybody does stuff wrong the first time, unit testing or whatever it is. So I'd say get feedback if you can. Just ask people. Start asking friends or coworkers, anybody who's somewhat of an expert or better at the subject than you are. If you ask people that don't know about it, they're not going to give you anything, or if they're on the same level, they're probably going to give you bad advice. So get people who know more and just ask them. Have them look at your stuff. Share it. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to hear that it's bad, because it's okay. Rad Neighbor asked a question up above. I only noticed because he tagged my name, but I think he asked it before too, about so he was asking about the architecting big and middle stuff and just getting that balance right. And I wanted to just mention a point that I think the time, like when you're working on a project, it's hard to know when you should refactor things, when you should change things and work on architectural issues. For me, I think that the point, like where it really stands out, is when something that should be easy isn't easy, right? When a change to a game that would be easy in the first week is suddenly hard, and it's going to take 2 days instead of 2 hours, or 2 weeks instead of 2 minutes, whatever it is, right? When you start to run into those kinds of problems where most of your changes, or even a good number of your changes, are very difficult, it's probably time to refactor. Ideally, you want to build systems that are really, really easy to change, really easy to extend, and just build upon. What about you, Charles? When
Yeah,
do you
that's
start refactoring? Is it usually around that same point when shit gets hard, or?
Um, think that, one thing I hear a lot, and I tend to agree with, obviously there's always exceptions to the rule, but you should refactor when you need to refactor. And that is, you write a piece of code, you get it working the way it needs to work, and then later on, if it doesn't play nice or it doesn't have all the functionality it needs, given some new constraint or some new feature, then you should refactor. Otherwise, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Don't run around. I mean, I don't know. It just depends. Like if you're in a really crappy legacy system that is very brittle, then yeah, you're gonna probably need to refactor a lot. But otherwise, and this is me like fighting. This answer is me fighting the perfectionist in me. So it's just a safe bet that I just tell myself, only refactor if I really need to. If there's an actual need to refactor in that this code is not working with what I'm trying to accomplish in the future.
Yeah. That said, I still do minor refactors constantly. Not big architectural refactors where I'm changing systems, but refactoring methods or classes and things to make them make more sense. And I do that whenever it's not apparent what's going on. So if I'm reading through my code and I'm explaining it to somebody and I'm like, and then this hold on, what does this do? The second I have to ask that question, I know it's time to refactor. I shouldn't have to ask what my code's doing. I should be able to read through it just like I'm reading a book and understand, or like an instruction manual that's not from IKEA, and understand exactly how everything's supposed. Actually, I do. IKEA instructions are usually pretty good. It's like the Walmart ones that are terrible, right? Right, so
Yeah. Oh yeah.
non-Walmart instructions, right? Like
They
you want to
dumb
be
it
able to
down
read
so
through it and
much.
tell exactly what's going on. And if you can't, like that's when I'll start renaming things or extracting things to methods, or even just splitting things to classes, or if things just get more than a couple hundred lines.
And you actually bring up a good point. There are actually different, I guess maybe types is the wrong word, but for lack of a better one, types of refactoring. The refactoring I was describing was I need to refactor so that my class can collaborate with other classes or is flexible enough to support this new functionality. But what you were talking about, and it's actually a great point, is refactoring for readability. And I think that's important because code is written the way it is, not for the computer. It's written that way for us. I mean, for all the computer cares, it could be bit code, but we need code to be readable because we're humans, and that's just a basic fact. So yeah, refactoring for readability is pretty important, and I would recommend you do that as often as you can, as you need to.
Yep, that's what I do almost there. I mean, I do it every day, right? Realistically, I'm constantly refactoring stuff like that. There was another question. Oh man, they
I
come so
leave a lot of
fast.
to-dos comments. Those are pretty much the only comments that I'll ever leave in my code, unless there's something that's like obscure, like a weird regex expression.
And I wouldn't say if it's not broke, don't fix it. I would say you got to know when it's broke. It's sometimes you don't know that things are broke, and it's broke as soon as it's difficult to work with. If
Yeah.
your code's not easy to work with, it's broke. It's time to fix it.
Yeah, broken kind of implies that it's actively not working, but that broke could be you can't read it, and to me that's broke on another level.
Yep.
I don't know, on a human level, I guess.
Okay, I'm trying to get back to all these questions, but I lost a bunch of them that I had there. Put question marks on the end of the questions. It makes it a whole lot easier to find them. Speaking of working with teams, artists, audio guys, how would building these tools affect the build? Should they always be in editor scripts or scriptable objects and not in the build? It depends on the game. Sometimes the data is not even stored in the game. Sometimes the data is stored on a web service or in some JSON file, some other data structure. If the game is bigger scale, a lot of the time that'll happen. Or if it's like an online game, you're almost never going to have very much content in there. Like if it's think like I don't know about some of those. The mobile ones are probably less like that. But a lot of the big PC games, if it's online, a lot of that data is pretty much just on the servers and then gets sent down and cached once, or sent down every time if it's secret-y type data. But how will it affect the build? Like I assume it just means like the build process. It should just go in like every time. If you have your stuff in scriptable objects, your designer should be able to commit those scriptable objects and have a build auto kick off and then be able to go test it out, right? They shouldn't have to, or I mean, really, they should be able to do it locally. If they're using scriptable objects, run it and play it, and then commit, and then it goes into the next build, right? Hopefully, it's just an automated build that kicks off and then goes out to everybody in QA or whoever's testing it. Maybe QA is grandma. Doesn't matter. You want to automate that process, right? You want to get those builds going out automatically if you can, because it's just anything. I feel like anything that you have to do more than a couple times, 2 or 3 times, you should probably look at automating it.
Yeah.
When is it not okay to separate code, and when do you do? Okay. If you have a top-down RPG, would you even separate it, or do you know how to make script usable by other systems? Yes, separate top-down. An RPG alone is huge. Like the camera view doesn't matter, right? You could be a first-person, third-person, top-down. The only difference is the rendering and visual sides. Like you're gonna do extra work there, but the RPG elements alone are huge, and it's tons and tons of code, a bunch of systems. All of those systems should be completely separated. Your movement, your inventory, your combat, your weapons, your quests, all of those things should be 100% separated and interchangeable. You should be able to pull things in and out relatively easily with an RPG. And I like RPGs as an example because they're just really huge games that have tons of systems, right? You have quests, you have items, you have fighting, you have magic, you have all kinds of things that you can put into there. And that's why the architecture course I'm doing is on an RPG, just so we can hit all those kinds of things. And somebody had asked, where is that? There it is. What is it? Wokeral. I don't know if I pronounced that right. He said, do you use unit testing for games? That's why I wanted to ask this question, Charles. It's perfect for you. I can't figure out how to test stuff other than rigid systems like inventory. So I use unit testing nonstop for testing AAA MMORPG game and other stuff now. I'm a huge fan. It took some time to get used to it, but oh man, it makes a huge difference. It makes things so much better and so much faster to work with. I don't have to start up the servers. I have to start up the clients. If I want to test my stuff, I just hit a button and it's instant. I know whether or not things work, and it documents my code for me, so I know how was this system supposed to work that this designer told me about a year ago. Oh, look, my unit test tells me exactly what it's supposed to do. Now I know why it's not working, how it's supposed to work. They say, hey, this thing broke. I go, okay, let me look at it. Okay, it's not doing that, right? Like apparently I didn't run the test or something, right? Or it's just not, sometimes it's just not tested, and then I'll go in and test it, and that gives me the documentation. How to do it with bigger systems, though, where it's not something really rigid. It's a little bit more complicated. It takes some practice. It's really about separating things out and making things substitutable. Using interfaces properly and using N substitute makes a big difference, so that you can just have a UI system that doesn't need a real inventory system to work, and you can call in the events and see if it does what it's supposed to do, or you can swap in your inventory system and then make your inventory system do something, and then your mocks in your UI system will tell you whether or not something happened, so you can be able to test all of these things kind of independently. What about you, Charles? Do you use much testing in games? I know you've done a lot of videos on them.
Sure do. Yeah, I mean, one thing to take a note of is you don't want to aim for 100% coverage. You're not going to be able to test like, oh, did this player collide with this thing, and you're not going to want to have to test all those little details like, oh, what happens when the user picks on this piece of the UI and drags it over here? Like, there's just certain things you inherently can't test. Not with unit test anyway, more like with integration or functional tests, but the thing about unit tests, yeah, there's just you want to test the things that are important to the functionality of your game at a fundamental level. And in business world, we call that business logic or your business rules. In the gaming world, that's going to be your game mechanics. So I don't know. For instance, let's say you had a skill tree system, and you can only have 100 points in any skill, and that's where the cap is. Well, one unit test could be you encapsulate that system into a class, and then you exercise it. You say, hey, I want to instantiate your test system with 100 or 99 skill points, or maybe 100 skill points, and then you run your add skill point method, and you just make sure in a test that it can't go past 100. That's just a simple example, but it's your business rules, your game mechanic rules that are what you should really be aiming to test. And also what Jason was saying is, yeah, it's kind of like a form of implicit documentation, because now someone who comes in and tests your game, or rather wants to work and add new functionality to your game, they can look at the test and say, oh yeah, look, this test ensures that skills can't go past 100. So what does that tell him? Implicitly or explicitly that your skill points are capped at 100, and that's all without him or her ever having to run the game and get the player into a state where they have 100 skill points, which may never even happen.
Yep. I want to show an actual unit test real quick, too.
Ooh, cool.
That kind of gives that as an example. So here, let me close all the other files.
After you show this, I'm gonna have to hop off the stream, sadly, but yeah, I'll stick around and we can take a look at this.
Just take a quick peek at this one. So this is kind of an example of what we were just saying, where they explain what happens. So this is like doing 1 damage at level 1, adding 10 of something, and I can check now and know whether or not this happened, whether or not doing a damage at that level does the thing that it's supposed to do or not. And if it doesn't, something breaks in there, which happened when I was refactoring this giant pool system. So it refactored the system down to be much more generic, so we could reuse all of the things and simplify things down and reduce network bandwidth, network traffic. And this broke, right? Like this is exactly, pull back up. This test broke. It wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. And I think it was, I don't remember the exact issue, but one of these things was not getting called. And doing the refactor just missed that part of the code. So, when you're refactoring and moving things around, cutting and pasting and stuff, it's very easy to miss things. I didn't have to go dig through to figure out what I missed because I ran my test and it said, hey, you didn't do this. So I look at the diff, like, oh, okay, that's the part. It's very easy. I didn't have to send it out to testers. I didn't have to go through that whole process of, oh no, everything's broken. Like, this part is tested, you're good. And anything that you have tested is going to be covered like that. So unit tests are huge. Definitely use them. So you got to head out, Charles?
Yeah. Oh, I just wanted to say, other Jason dropped a chat and he made a really good point on this topic. I was trying to explain, like, you wouldn't want to test like clicking a piece of your UI. Like, so for instance, let's say you were writing an RPG and you had like a hot bar and there was a potion there. And so you want to test that when I double click the potion that it consumes the potion, right? It seems like that would be a logical thing to test. But when you think about what's really happening, it's not that you're clicking on the potion, it's that you're consuming the potion. So what are you really fundamentally testing? You're just fundamentally testing that when you consume the potion that it heals you for 10 or something like that. So you just have to think at a lower level. You don't want to really think about the user interactions, because double clicking on the potion is only one way you can consume it. You can also consume it, maybe by right clicking it and clicking on consume, or maybe there's a hotkey. So all those are ways to run that method call. But as long as you're testing fundamentally that consume method on that potion class, for instance, that's really what's important. And so I bring that up because I know a lot of the time people get really hung up on, oh, how do I test this mono behavior? And you look at the mono behavior, and I would say, well, I wouldn't test that mono behavior because it's not really doing anything other than acting as a client for some other class. And that other class is what really is the thing that needs to be tested. I see that Wakaroll has one more question for me before I head out.
Oh, okay. That's more for Charles. Who was the one right above that?
I've seen video about builders, a.bag and uninventory seems cool, but do you have to define a and un classes for each test context, or mix stuff in them? Or you mix stuff in them? I mix stuff in them, to be honest with you. I mean, yeah, I would, if I had 100 classes, I would just put them all in the A class. I mean, maybe that's a little crazy, but the A and the un class are just helper classes. So I'm not really concerned about them being too large or whatever. For those of you who don't know, I'll put a link. He's referring to my most recent video where I talked about test data builders as they can be applied to unit testing. And it's just a way basically to an easy way to create your systems under test and their collaborators with some syntactic sugar. It just makes it so that they're way easier to read, and it actually also makes sure that they're easy to maintain too. Because when you think about your unit test, oftentimes you're going to have to instantiate a lot of objects so you can exercise them. But this basically takes that creational logic and encapsulates it into one place. So if you do need to, if you have changes to the constructor of a class or to the signature of a method, now you only really have to do it in one place. So I put a link to that in the chat there.
Nice. I'm gonna have to check that out. I totally agree, though. I need to see how you did it there. But I always do stuff like I'll have some helper method to create whatever thing it is that I'm using. Usually, like in this game, it's NPCs and players most of the time. Just got a thing there because if you go through and do that setup in every test, you're just killing yourself, right? You're gonna go back and make a change, and suddenly you have to update 300 tests or something because you added a new field to NPCs that has to be set, right? You want that in some shared common spot so that you don't have to reset that up, and ideally with some optional setup stuff so you can control it and configure it without having to do much work. Like I make mine with just you can see here, it's just optional properties. Just hit, comma and pick my other properties and pop them in there if I want to override something. I love that. I want to check that video out though. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I do some acting in that video, so it's always fun to see when people tell me it's fun to watch me make a fool of myself in my little skits. So I'm just gonna keep doing those.
Hey, I like it.
Thanks.
All right, man. Well, I don't want to hold you for too long if you got to head out. I'll take a couple more questions, and then I'm probably going to head out too because I think my wife is probably. She'll be back soon.
That's exactly why I'm leaving. My wife's like, "Hello, I'm home."
Been waiting for you, Charles. It's time to get out. You got to keep the wife
All right, guys.
happy.
Well, that was a lot of fun.
We'll keep going, everybody, for just a few more minutes.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
Hey,
I'll
thanks
see you
for
guys
coming,
later.
man. Appreciate it.
Bye.
All right, I'm gonna just hit a couple more questions and just go over them. I guess we won't build this. We'll build this later. I thought we were gonna build the whole thing, but so many questions, I didn't even keep up. Um, Somebody mentioned partial classes. I hate those things. I'll have to check out Charles' implementation. Maybe it's a non-terrible partial class thing. It sounds like it probably is. It seems like it's more like partial classes as helpers there for that. But in real code, non-test code, I hate partial classes. Okay, let's see. What other questions did we have? I know there's one about what did he say? He said, what do you think about the myth of unhealthy nutrition of programmers and taking caffeine from the vein directly? Do you think that do you really think that more successful coders have a strict diet? I've never met coders with well, I think I met like one coder with a strict diet and he still took caffeine pills every day. Um, I would assume that having a better diet is going to help because it's just going to make you think a little bit better and do better at things and feel better. But I don't think that a good diet programmer versus a bad diet programmer is going to be any way to tell the difference, right? Like I think that you might get better at it as you're healthier, but that's yeah. I don't know that there's a huge difference. I didn't see myself like even after changing my diet a little bit and losing a bunch of weight. Actually, I shouldn't say that 'cause my diet's still terrible. I just lost a bunch of weight. I don't know what I'm talking about. Ignore me on the diet stuff. Just let's find some more questions though. Thomas had a question. If you had a weapon with class and armor class, both inherit from item and class, and store weapon and armor in a list of items, you want to read the int. Okay, hold on. I'm trying to figure this question out. You store a weapon and armor in a list of items, and you want to read an int unique to the weapon or armor from the list. Oh, okay. Well, in that case, it depends on exactly what you're doing. So if you're trying to read like the armor class value of your helmet or something, or the strength on your arm piece or whatever, you're going to want to have some reference to that arm piece. Like I'm thinking it's like a tooltip, a pop-up or something that shows that value when you see it. For the overall stats of something, though, I wouldn't even be looking at those. We'd be firing off some events when those items change. So like when you get a new helmet and you put it on, we should be firing off an event to tell the stat system, hey, our inventory has changed, our stats, this stat has changed, or these sets of stats have changed, figure out their new values. Because a lot of the time you're not just adding and subtracting, you need to recalculate these things because you have abilities and multipliers and other things that are changing them and modifying them in different ways. And if you're just adding and subtracting them as you put them on, especially once you're using floating point values, you're going to run into errors and you're going to run into problems like, I've seen bugs in real AAA MMOs where you could equip and unequip an item, and every time you did, you gained a health, and you just keep going. Keep clicking it, and you could get your health up all the way as high as you wanted. These kinds of bugs happen because people aren't thinking about the bigger picture when you're building these things out. They're thinking, oh, I don't want to recalculate that because that's a tiny bit slow. It's not slow. But you get into the mindset that, hey, I'm trying to optimize these things and make them quick and not worry about that bigger problem. So I guess the point is it creates a bigger problem later. So I would say you want to have a reference to the thing just to answer the question. And then for the bigger picture of like all of your armor class or all of a stat or something, you should be getting that ideally from another system. So you're either referencing it or getting some combined value there. Let's see, what else we got here? Okay, a couple comments to hide. That's an interesting one. And somebody mentioned partial. Yeah, I really do hate partial classes. The knight, where did he go? He's right there. I just haven't moved him back over. So I got him set up. I put him outside, made him light up, made him talk. I don't think anybody noticed. It was just kind of like a weird decoration sitting out there, I think. A couple people might have heard it, and that was about it. But I will be doing a whole video on that. It was really interesting getting that thing figured out, too. Like how to code that thing on the Pi, how to get the Raspberry Pi all working. It was an interesting project. I think next time around, I want to make a big virtual or like an augmented reality type thing where it projects some stuff out onto the driveway and let kids like stomp on them or do something else. Let's see. What else we got here? Any other questions? Do you think a game programmer should be really good at algorithms and data structures, or is basic knowledge good enough? Yeah, I mean, being good at data structures and algorithms is very, very valuable. It's very helpful. It'll come in really handy just along the way as you're building. I would not use that as a gate, though. Don't like be like, hey, I'm not going to make games yet because I'm learning data structure. So I'm not going to make my game yet because I want to figure out more algorithms and I need to study these things. A lot of the time, it's easy to just get into the habit of studying things and never using them or never putting them into practice. What I like to do is build the things that I want to build. And then when I get to the situation where I think like, hey, this could, maybe there's some design here, maybe there's some algorithm that's going to make this thing that I want to do that's slow, fast. Then I'll start digging more into it. Also, just kind of looking into algorithms for fun every now and then. I'll just kind of watch random videos and learn a new trick. I'm like, oh, okay, that kind of applies here and there. But I wouldn't just spend a lot of time studying them. If you're going in for an interview at Google or Amazon or something, study algorithms nonstop, right? Like that's super important there for the interview process and probably for a small portion of the jobs. But just for building your own games, I wouldn't put too much energy and effort into it until you actually need it. Let's see, any other questions? Does the whole pattern need to be under the same design pattern / philosophy? Like if I'm making Ether MVC / I don't know, does everything in that project need to be built upon the pattern? No. Usually it's a subset of systems that are built upon the patterns. But what you do want to have are really strict or good coding standards. You want to have it so that your code looks and feels the same way wherever you are. You don't want to have variables that are named totally differently. You don't want to have methods that are named differently. You don't want to be using completely different patterns or copies of different helpers and patterns around the project. You really want to make sure that you're kind of keeping everything good and cohesive, but you don't necessarily need to apply the same pattern everywhere. A lot of the time that you'll find that you are, though. Like if you're using a factory pattern somewhere or observer pattern, you can know exactly where that hooks in and where it makes sense, and you're going to want to use it. You probably don't need it if you're never changing anything about the object, right? You might not need a factory pattern, but if you you get into the case where you're creating 5 different things and you're doing them all 5 different ways, you're going to know that you want to put that pattern in. And yeah, like Jason said, it's like bringing a hammer to put in a screw, right? Like you got a hammer and you just want to whack it in. Don't do it. Use whatever tool works for this specific job that you're doing. And where can you find out what patterns work for each use case? That comes a bit with experience, a bit with building projects, and probably a bit just from watching other people and seeing what they're doing, looking at different systems and asking, how would you implement this specific system? Because it's gonna vary. I mean, there are thousands of possible systems you could be putting into thousands of different types of games. So it's going to come down to the specific scenario. I would ask, because a lot of the time it's really common stuff, like you're building a role-playing game and you want to build a certain system for it. You can be able to look up what people have used and what worked well, especially on bigger AAA games. Or if you're building a first-person shooter and you're trying to figure out how to do network prediction type stuff, like what patterns do you use there, or how to send network data, or there are lots of examples. They're all just kind of flying over my head right now, though. But yeah, I would say look at the specific scenario, look for examples of patterns and ways that people have implemented that. Usually you'll find that people have got a good example out there for it. Let's see, any other questions in here? I'm going to go for like 5 to 10 more minutes. Maybe cut this off around 1 o'clock. I think my wife will be back by then, and I'm getting really, really thirsty. So let's see, what else we got for questions? Okay, and just real quick on using scriptable objects for design. I think it's neat. I think it's pretty cool. I don't use it for gameplay logic, though. So I know a lot of people have seen the videos and they think it's something really fun to do, but I find it just a little bit too confusing. Like I can build these systems up. For me, it seems a little bit slower than I want because I have to go back and forth into the editor and wire things up. I have to go back and look at them in the editor. So I try to kind of keep scriptable objects as data only now. And I really just try to minimize the amount of functionality. Let's see, what else we got here? And don't worry, as your rad neighbor says, because he feels like he's constantly refactoring because of poor planning. The fact that you're constantly refactoring is probably a good thing, especially early on, because it means that you're realizing the issues and making them better, ideally. And I highly recommend that. If you're not refactoring and you're just constantly hacking things into your code and adding in more public ways and more ways to get into stuff, or you're just putting in random little hacks everywhere, that's a big mess. You want to be refactoring and cleaning stuff up. You want to make stuff as easy to use as possible. And somebody recommended Game Programming Patterns by Robert Nystrom. Great book. Highly recommend it. I think I've linked it a bunch of times. Go check it out. You can watch it free online or read it free online. I'd grab the Amazon copy too. Support the dude. It's good stuff. Yes, Jason did have a point though. I see his right there. If you're rewriting code a lot, then you may be over engineering systems in advance, which is something that a lot of people do and something I've done a lot too. It's where you predict what you're going to use without really having any idea what you're going to use, and you predict wrong and you build it wrong, and then you just keep doing that. You keep pre-building things that you're not using yet. I like to just build the methods as I'm using them and then start implementing them, because what I find is that a lot of the time I'll guess what I need, I'll put them in, and then realize I don't need them. And even when I'm building them as I'm going, like I'm putting together systems, putting together the methods, a lot of the time I'll realize like, hey, this is really pretty redundant, and like I'm only using it once to do a slightly different version of this. Let's get rid of it. Or like maybe we can just combine these two things into one and just get rid of it. Keep deleting things and cleaning things up. Nothing more that I like. I can't talk now. But I love deleting code, right? Last week I spent lots of time deleting thousands of lines of code. It was great. Everything got easier to understand, easier to read, and just a whole lot cleaner. So if you can delete code and simplify things, that's usually the way to go. Let's see, how would you manage the interconnection between scripts? I'm confused about using Unity events and avoiding Getcomponent code. Okay, this I usually do with Constructor Injection. So, well, it's either a combination of either getting components. So I don't mind using a get component on an awake and caching it. Nothing wrong there, as long as I'm not doing it, thousands of times and doing it constantly throughout the game. But if it's just, level loads up and I get some components to get the references, totally fine. But the other thing I like to do, because I'm not always using mono behaviors, in fact, I'd recommend only using mono behaviors if you need them. Don't use them just by default. But the thing that I do there is just constructor injection. So I'll create the object and I'll pass in the dependencies into the constructor. You can't do that with a mono behavior, which is one of the many reasons that I wouldn't recommend using a mono behavior just by default. But with a regular class, you can just pass in the things that you need. You can cache them in the constructor. If you're in Rider, you just type CTOR and it generates your constructor. You can put in the parameters that you want and kind of auto cache them. It's beautiful. But that's how I usually do it. It's just when things are getting created, I give them their dependencies at creation time. It's kind of like dependency injection. Well, it is dependency injection, just without a framework. It's nice, simple, clean, and easy dependency injection. What patterns do you find most useful in game programming? State machines, factory pattern, command pattern for certain types of games, observer pattern for sure. I think those are the ones that stick out really, really strong to me. There are probably some others, but let's see. We've got a couple more questions. By the way, yeah, Jason's story is awesome on here. I gotta do a call and just get him, just bring him on and just talk live about stuff. Maybe do that next week. He's always got amazing answers to things, and he's so much faster at answering things than I am. Let's see. Were there any other questions? Take like 2 or 3 more before I head out. Before I die of thirst. Oh wait. How can I resolve this problem? Where is the problem? Oh, see. This question is spread too far. Can you repost that question there? Like the whole thing in one? Oh, you're gonna see the office again? Sure. So there's the Night Dude, the Vanguard posters and stuff, and the Death Star, and the quest bars. It's good stuff. I really love this office. Moving to this office was the best thing ever. It's cool. And it's nice and quiet, so I can do these live streams any time of the day and not be overwhelmed with noise. How do you design levels, model, whole house in Blender? I don't design levels generally. I have level designers and artists do that. I think that if you're a programmer, you probably want to focus a lot of your energy on the programming side and not so much on the art and design side. You want to be able to build the games and let other people spend a lot of their time on the stuff. Let's see. How long are your courses available, and when's the next one besides Monday? The one that's starting on Monday is closing tomorrow. If somebody has to join, there are a couple people who have to get in late just because they have work-related things, or I understand that, like getting work to approve things can be slow. But in general, the main page is going to shut down for registration tomorrow night, and then we're going to kick off the course on Monday. The next time we run it, I'm not really sure. I expect this to run for a couple months. I don't think that I'll do another architecture one for probably a year or so. But I'll probably do some other types of courses. I really want to do one on networking that may kind of build upon the architecture to show how to build like a bigger networked game. Like you want to build like an FPS or an MMO or something, how to go over that whole process and how to understand how you can build that and keep it clean without it becoming a mess and synchronize all that stuff. But yeah, I don't know beyond that. So let's see. And then Jason's story. Jason needs a channel. I keep telling him that too. He needs a channel there. As soon as he gets his office done, it looks like. And then yeah, he's on Discord. I don't know why he doesn't have mod on my Discord channel. There's no reason not to. So we'll figure that out after this call too. Get him modded in there. Anything else anybody got? Otherwise, I'm going to cut it off and go grab a drink. Oh, wait. I have questions. Oh, okay. Cool. I see it. The course is just, it's in the description. It's just at game.courses. I just moved it over to the main page. It's on a subpage normally, but I moved it over temporarily to make it easy. Anything else? I'm excited to. When do I use mono behaviors? When I need to interact with the game engine, when I need to get an update call or an awake or something, and it makes sense for that component. And it's got to be something that needs to be a component on a game object. If it's not going to be a component on a game object, it doesn't make sense. Let's see. Somebody else asked a question. Can you come up with a good question to answer for me? I can't. I'm terrible at that. I took a leaf out of your book and ordered some Kallax shelves. Nice, the Kallaxes. I love those things, the little white IKEA shelves. It's funny because I've got those, and you guys, like I said, I turned it around. You can see that one over there. I've got tons of them just throughout the house. It's awesome. I love it. And I've gotten good at building them. It's the only thing from IKEA that I can build fast because I've built so many of them. The Discord server, let's just post a link real quick. Let's pop it up. Open it up, and I'll just drop a link in chat right now. Quick invitation. Copy. And paste. There we go. Dropped it in chat. Go ahead and join. And what I think about doing logic outside of mono behaviors and wrapping it, I generally like it. I don't do it all the time, though. I don't find that I get a whole lot of value out of it sometimes, but on bigger cases, like a bigger class that's going to have a lot of logic, I really like it because mocking mono behaviors and testing mono behaviors is generally just harder. It's not as easy to test a mono behavior as it is a class, and it's not as easy to keep it clean. So I like it for the most part, just separating it out and just having that humble object pattern. So I'd recommend it. Yeah, I got the blue hoodie on. All my other hoodies are dirty and smoky from being in Las Vegas. It's terrible. It's like the worst part about going there. All my clothes come back really stinky. What MMO am I working on? It's Pantheon. I'll post a link there too. That's the MMO. It's a fun game. It's gonna be huge. Oh, I think so. I love it. And best architecture to write advanced AI. This will probably be the last one because I think we're at one. So for more advanced AI, you generally want to use some sort of either behavior tree or state machine. I've never been a huge fan of behavior trees myself. I've used them and looked at them, but I find that they're really hard to explain to the game designers, and they're a bit harder to debug and understand. State machines usually handle everything that I need to do, and they do it in a nice, easy to understand, logical way that I can really show to a designer or other people on the team and have them understand it. So I would say that's kind of, you want to really get a good understanding of state machines and state pattern. And no, I'm not in LA, but I'm outside. I'm not far from LA. All right. Thanks everybody for joining. Hope you guys had fun. If you guys have other questions that I didn't answer, just shoot me an email. It's just jason@unity3d.college. And I'll just answer away. I probably have to change my email eventually. But yeah, just shoot me an email. I'll answer them as I can. And thanks for coming. Don't forget to hit the like button and share stuff if you guys like the stuff. And I think that's it.